Hello everyone, welcome back to VENKANNA ENGLISHGURU. Friends, we have started a topic called History of American Literature. As a part of this, and where we started discussing different periods of American literature, and we discussed, and the first one, the colonial period. And friends, today we are going to talk about a very interesting period, that is the early national period of American literature. Friends, during this period, you can find important writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson or Walt Whitman, and the importance of Civil War, American Renaissance, American Romanticism, and the concept of Transcendentalism, and the concept of American individualism, and how different writers from this American literature, how they were actually influenced by Indian philosophy and different ideas. And this is what the important period, and from where you need to focus on more on if you really want to score good and to have good score in your examination. And early national period, my friends, and and the early national period 1775 and 1785, and the period between 1775 and 1865, this is considered to be early national period. The years 1775 and 1828, this particular period, this is actually called early national period, ending with the triumph of Jacksonian democracy in 1828, and signaled the emergence of national imaginative literature. Washington Irving, during this period, one of the most important writers of the time, Washington Irving achieved international fame through his essays and stories, and he was a popular essayist, popular short story writer of the time during in American literature during the early national period. Friends, the first American comedy in English in American literature, you need to know, because in the examination you will get what is the first comedy in English literature, what is the first tragedy in English literature, because we discussed as a part of history of English literature, Gorboduc, the first tragedy, Rolf Reister and Doyster, first comedy. In the same way, what was the first history in American literature? First comedy, first tragedy in American literature, we are going to talk. The first American comedy was Royal Taylor's The Contrast. The Contrast is considered to be the first American comedy. And the earliest American novel, first American novel that was actually produced by William Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy. The Power of Sympathy, the first important novel that is produced by Americans. The establishment of 1815 of the first enduring American magazine. The first magazine. What is the first magazine in English literature? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The first important journal or magazine that was available in English literature during the Old English period. The Anglo-Saxon. In the same way, in American literature, the first American magazine was the North American Review. The first, because these are the some important facts that every aspirant of net examination should know. There's the first comedy and first American novel and the first American magazine, the North American Review. Friends, another important writer, and you could see Charles Brogdon Brown wrote a distinctly American versions of the Gothic novel. Friends, you know what is Gothic novel, what is historical novel, what is stream of consciousness novel, what is psychological novel, what is historical novel. Like we had lengthy discussion when we discussed history of English literature, where we had a lot of discussion. So in the same way, the concept of Gothic novel, the period from 1786 to 1800 in English literature, that is considered to be Gothic novel period, where we discussed William Godwin, William Beckford, Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Gregory Lewis, and Mary Shelley, and Jane Austen, the popular Gothic novelist during Romantic period in English literature. In the same way, in American literature, in the early national period from 1775 to 1865, They also composed a few Gothic novels, and one of them, what is the first Gothic novel? The Castle of Toronto, which is written by Horace Walpole. In the same way, in American literature, the first Gothic novels were written by Charles Brugden Brown. So, the moment you think of Charles Brugden Brown, the Gothic novel writer of American literature, like that you need to remember. The career of James Fenimore Cooper, the first major American novelist, and the first major important novelist of American literature was James Fenimore Cooper. And William Cullen Bryant and Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe, everybody knows because he's so popular short story writer and wrote poetry that was relatively independent of English precursors, which means they created their own styles instead of following British styles. Who these two, William Cullen Bryant and Edgar Allan Poe, they have started creating their own styles instead of simply blindly following the models that were already created by the English writers. Some of the writers, my friends. Next, you see in the year 1760. The year 1760 was published the first a long series of slave autobiographies, and slave autobiographies written by African American slaves who had escaped or been freed from the clutches of Americans. So there are a few Africans who were brought from Africa to America. Later they were set free or they escaped from the American land, and where they wrote a lot of literature. This literature is considered to be slave narratives or slave autobiographies. And this happened. The concept of slave narratives were written only after 1760s. And in the previous period where we discussed a few writers of slave narratives, and one of them was Phillips Wheatley, Frederick Douglass like. Most of these were published between 1830 and 1865. So slave narratives were so popular. The concept of slave narratives, the concept of slave autobiographies were originated only in American literature. Remember this. And these were written by the American slaves and who were brought from Africa and who were actually considered to be the African American slaves. From there, you can understand the concept of the black theory, black revolutionary theory, and black literature, the African literature, the African American concepts. So, and you will have a lot of discussion about it. Most of these were published between 1830 1865. This is a very dangerous, very difficult period because not only the African slaves, they recognized their own freedom, and the local Americans recognized the importance of freedom, independence, and mainly from friends. The period from 1828 and 1865, very important. A lot of influential literature was written by a number of local Americans, not only by African American slaves, but also from the local Americans like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, because this is what very important period, important age as far as American literature is concerned. A lot of literature has been, and because of this literature and because of the writers who were born during this period who wrote a lot of literature, a number of American writers were greatly inspired. We'll talk all of them. And these slave narratives were published during 1830 and 1865, which is very influential period of the time. And what were the popular examples? Frederick Douglass, and who composed Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass in 1845, the popular example for slave narratives. And Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of Slave Girl, another important slave narrative, and composed by Harriet Jacobs. Very important, my friends, remember. And this is very important. Romantic period in America, or American Romanticism, simply I can say American Romanticism or American Renaissance, friends. I don't want to talk much about what is Renaissance because I spoke a lot about during my discussions with regard to Renaissance in English literature. And briefly, I know that you are aware of the importance of Romanticism in literature. Romanticism, and first how it actually became popular in Germany, and how John Wolfgang von Goethe, John Wolfgang von Herder, and Frederick Siegel, and F.L. Lucas, and how they and what they actually spoke with regard to Romanticism, where we discussed a lot with regard to Romanticism. Liberalism in literature. Romanticism is nothing but liberalism, independence, freedom from the clutches of and grandeur, from the clutches of and restrictions of writing literature. So once we see Romantic period in America, the span, very, very important, my friends, several times in the history of net, set, and different examinations, this bit was asked. And American Romanticism, what is the period 1828 to 65 is called American Romanticism. 1828 to 1865 is called American Renaissance. Who coined the word American Renaissance? F.O. Matheson. When? Where? Who were popular American romanticists? Who were popular American Renaissance experts? Like there were plenty of bits if you refer to previous question papers. So the span between 1828 to 65, very, very important. 1828 to 65, from the Jacksonian era to Civil War. Civil War, my friends, 1860 to 65. And often identified the Romantic period in America or American Romanticism. What does it mean by American Romanticism? What actually happened in English literature? What is Romanticism? Liberalism in literature. And they avoided all the rules of writing literature. The literature is not about society. Literature is about the poet's sake. Art is not for art's sake. Art is for the poet's sake. This is the major principle of, and literature is not a set of skills. Literature is a product of imagination, fancy, imagination, organic sensibility. Very many points that they spoke about. Same thing, same ideals, and the writers who lived during this period talk about the same, imitate the same. That is what American Romanticism. This period is sometimes known as American Renaissance. American Renaissance. What is Renaissance? Rebirth, reawakening, readdressing, re-identifying the identity of the man in the world. What actually happened in America? Sorry, what actually happened in Italy when Renaissance became popular? What actually happened about Renaissance when it actually became popular in English literature? And people have recognized, people wanted freedom. Man is born free, but you can find him everywhere in chains. And you can see, I think, therefore I am, a popular dialogue made by Descartes. Why did he make that particular statement? And what gave importance, inspiration to Descartes? Okay, Galileo or Sir Philip Sidney, Edmund Spencer, during the early 16th century. Same thing gave inspiration to the writers who lived during 1828 to 1865 in American literature. That is what it is. The period from 1828 to 65 is considered to be American Renaissance. So the kind of ideas that were born in the minds of Italian writers and painters during 14th century, and the kind of ideas that were inspired English writers during Renaissance in 1500 to 1660, same thing happened in American literature during 1828 and 1865. That is what it is considered to be American Renaissance. The title of this American Renaissance, this is actually coined, friends, you need to know the word coined. Coined means first used. Coined, first used. This is first coined, used, introduced by F.O. Matheson. And he composed a popular book, influential book, and about its outstanding writers. And we'll talk in the next. So remember, who coined the word American Renaissance? F.O. Matheson. What is American Renaissance? 1828 to 65. Very, very popular. And this American Renaissance, which is also called American Romanticism. Remember. Next, it is also sometimes called the age of Transcendentalism. This period, 1828 to 1865, this is called American Romanticism, American Renaissance, Transcendentalism, individualism, my friends, remember. So it is also called Transcendentalism. because the writers who lived during this period were called Transcendentalists. What does it mean by Transcendentalism? We'll talk. Next, after the philosophical and literary movement centered on Emerson. So, the major important figure as Sir Phillips in English literature, or Wordsworth in English Romanticism, and in American Romanticism, one of the most important precursors was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the father of American literature, the father of American essay, Emerson, and who coined the word transcendentalism, dominated New England. I spoke to you. I already mentioned New England is nothing but America. Next, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and the early feminist Margaret Fuller, who composed the first feminist essay in American literature, Women in the 19th Century, 1845. Women in the 19th Century, several times it was asked, my friends. So, Margaret Fuller, the first feminist in American literature. And all these, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and so all these were transcendentalists, American romanticists, American Renaissance experts, and these were also called individualists. And literary aims of many contemporary American writers. So, who are the popular American romanticists? You can see this is also called American Transcendentalist, American individualism. What is transcendentalism? In one simple word, it's a form of meditation. It's a kind of Indian philosophy which influenced writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, writers like Henry David Thoreau. That's what Henry David Thoreau was the first person who spoke about the importance of civil disobedience, and that inspired Mahatma Gandhi. You just remember this. And these are the popular American transcendentalists. And the leader and the father, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, and Margaret Fuller, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, popular writers, my friends, remember. So all these were considered to be, these were the major important writers who wrote a lot of literature to talk about the ideas of America. Though America got independence in 1776, but people of America rediscovered themselves only during 1828 and 1865. This is what the assumption which you can understand when you read the poetry, when you read the essays of these writers. Okay, and I hope you always remember this. Share our videos, and people who are seriously preparing for not just competitive purpose, and these are also very useful to the students of MA or BA literature, or students who are seriously interested to learn some little bit literature. So this may create certain impact or certain interest towards reading literature. That is what, my friend, share our information to a large number of people and to your friends and to the literary community. Okay. Next, it was the age of not only of continuing written by William Cullen Bryant and Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, the popular writers. Okay. Next, it was also the novels and short stories written by these popular writers at the time. These were associated with, and friends, remember, 18th century is also called the age of Ralph Waldo Emerson. 19th century, Walt Whitman. 20th century, Robert Frost. We'll talk. So, during this period, you could find a lot of impact of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And the popular novelists and short story writers, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edmund Melville, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and the Southern novelist William Gilmore Simms, and the popular novelist and popular and writers of the time. You could also see during this period, and a lot of poetry has been written by writers like Edgar Allan Poe and John Greenleaf Whittier and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who composed a lot of poetry and essays in the form, and where you could read. He wrote poems like Brahma. He wrote poems like The Nation's Strength, and very popular poems that were composed by Emerson. Henry Wordsworth Longfellow, and the popular translator And the most innovative, influential of all American poets, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman began his writing mainly after 1850. That's what, 1800 to 1900. This is actually called the age of Walt Whitman, and the popular writer, and who composed a lot of poetry, my friends. And of the beginning of the distinguished American criticism, see, American criticism which is actually popularized by different writers, and one of them, Edgar Allan Poe, and James Russell Lowell, the popular critics, apart from Margaret Fuller, the first feminist. And the tradition of African American poetry. So, the moment you talk about American literature, you could also talk about African American literature. The moment you talk about African, you could also talk about African American, because there is a lot of connection. So when you read American literature, indirectly you are reading African American literature. When you read African literature, indirectly you are also reading African American literature, because there is a close connection between these two literatures with African American themes. So the tradition of African American poetry by women was continued by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the popular African American poet. African American novel was inaugurated by William Wells Brown's Clotet and Harriet Wilson's Our Nick, the popular African American poem and a novel and novels, you can see. These are the major important events or incidents of early national period of American literature that began from 1775 and ended in 1865. This is little bit introduction with regard to the second period of American literature, my friends. Next video we'll talk about another period. See you all. Like our videos, share our videos to your friends and well-wishers.